Let's go ahead and jump in with the big breaking news. Put this up on the screen from The Intercept. There were many ways of leading these obits for Henry Kissinger. The Intercept goes with top U.S. diplomat responsible for millions of deaths dies at 100. Let me read you a little bit of this. They say, few people have had a hand in as much death and destruction, as much human suffering in so many places around the world as Henry Kissinger. This was written by journalist Nick Turse, who we actually had on the show, I believe in the past year, was Emily and I were on. He had uncovered new deaths attributable to Kissinger, even, in the past couple of years in Cambodia. He goes on to write, Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor, Secretary of State under two presidents, and longtime eminence grise of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, died on November 29th at his home in Connecticut, 100 years old. He helped to prolong the Vietnam War, expand that conflict into neutral Cambodia, facilitated genocides in Cambodia, East Timor, and Bangladesh, accelerated civil wars in southern Africa, and supported coups and death squads throughout Latin America. He had the blood of at least 3 million people on his hands, according to his biographer, Greg Grandin. Goes on to quote, there were few people who have had as much a hand in death and destruction, as much human suffering in so many places around the world as Henry Kissinger, according to veteran war crimes prosecutor Reed Brody. So 100 years, lived a long time, advised literally every president.
Of the last 12, I
and
believe.
Hopeful presidents like Hillary Clinton, was a symbol of, both the sort of arrogance and casual disregard for human life, using the entire world as a chessboard and human beings as pawns and playthings on that chessboard. The sort of arrogance that precipitated the war on terror and our misadventures, neocon misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he is, at long last, Saagar, dead.
Well, I'll give my hottest take is I don't think Kissinger was uniquely bad in any respect. If anything, I think he was actually much better than many of the people who occupied top charges in American foreign policy. On Vietnam, I've never understood, and I was telling you this earlier, why people like McGeorge Bundy and Robert McNamara were not nearly as reviled as Kissinger. I mean, Kissinger, sure, he expanded the secret bombing in Cambodia, but him and Nixon signed the Treaty of Paris and they got us the hell out of Vietnam. They had the Vietnamization process. Détente was one of the most successful foreign policy things that we needed at the time. The SALT I Treaty froze the insane missile spending that the LBJ and Kennedy Johnson administration were doing. The opening of China remains one of the great master classes in American foreign policy. And my big meta kind of take on why I get annoyed with some of the criticism of Kissinger is the reason why the left hates Kissinger are the reasons that the neocons hated him too, because he refused to incorporate quote unquote morality into his foreign policy. Now, I know that sounds bad, but one of the reasons why I've been so against like moralistic campaigns around Israel, around Ukraine, is that weaponized empathy is a bad way to conduct relations between states. Kissinger disregarded that along with Nixon and pursued, in most cases, a pretty realist policy and was confined by some difficult political circumstances at the time. So I think people like Rumsfeld, who, by the way, is the person who eventually defeated Kissinger in bureaucratic combat, people like McGeorge Bundy, people like McNamara, many of I forget the CIA director's name for Ronald Reagan and all of them, they're far worse in terms of,
George H.W. Bush.
But he was the president. And that actually brings me back to Kissinger was not the decider. It was Nixon. It was Ford. It was Kennedy. It was...
Kissinger was incredibly influential.
Yes, he was
over a long period of time.
Sure.
Kissinger was literally picking out places on the map to bomb,
so
indiscriminately bomb.
Yeah.
And so you and I have a fundamental difference of opinion, a philosophical difference in terms of conduct and morality. And, I'm opposed to genocide. I'm opposed to war crimes. This man was a war criminal. There's no two ways about it. Read Christopher Hitchens' book on it if you want to know all the details. But I mean, even just with regard to Vietnam, he intentionally blew up peace talks in an attempt to try to get Nixon into the White House. Then he's rewarded with the National Security Advisor's job. So even if you're just talking about Vietnam, he prolongs this conflict for years and expands it into Cambodia and Laos. The U.S. dropped 540,000 bombs on those places. They slaughtered 150 to 500,000 Cambodian civilians. So, I can't really just look past that. And the other piece I would say, even if you don't care about genocide, backing Pinochet in Chile, these brutal military dictatorships, even if you're like, I don't really care if it serves American interests, the other piece of it, and why it is so consistent and why he's like the grandfather of neocons, is because there's such a level of arrogance thinking that we can just move these pieces on the chessboard around, not care about any of the humanity involved, and not experience any sort of fallout or blowback from those sort of adventures. So he did support the war in Iraq. Look, it's not like he was opposed to it, because this is completely consistent with his ideology. Now, the neocons may have tried to wrap their ideology in idealism, but the reality is that they were very much consistently trying to pursue their own version of Kissinger's strategy, which is, again, why, in spite of all of his various record of criminality over many decades, he still was feted by elites from both parties consistently. And, you know, we're talking a lot about the loss of U.S. credibility and how can they ever say anything with a straight face about care of democracy, human rights, et cetera, given the support of Netanyahu's, you know, indiscriminate bombing in Gaza right now. You know, Kissinger really is like the grandfather of that too. We can point to the Iraq War and the loss of U.S. credibility, but it really goes back to him and the total disregard for law, constitutionality, and any sort of care and concern for human rights.
I understand. I just don't think human rights or morality or any of these things really have anything to play whenever it comes to how you should conduct yourself, because ultimately you find yourselves like the Biden administration and all the governments before them backing places like Saudi Arabia and then talking about other things in Ukraine. It's like it's never going to be consistent. Whenever you live in a messy world, it's going to be messy, so you might as well disregard the pretense. I remember, I think he was caught on one of the Nixon tapes basically saying exactly this. I would just say again, I don't think he's uniquely bad in that period of American history.
Listen, I could buy that I think part of why he stands out for people as such a uniquely evil figure is because he is this sort of symbol of the banality of evil that was embraced by presidents of both parties over such a long period of time.
Maybe.
And so, yeah, to say like, oh, well, other American like foreign policy advisors did bad things is like, obviously that's
but to me,
true.
It's way worse.
I mean, I don't know how you get worse than being responsible for like millions of people's deaths and backing genocides in various places and military coups, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, but that's my point, is that by this regard, I mean, FDR heavily supported Joseph Stalin. He bailed him out in many respects, and Stalin was responsible for in many cases more deaths than Hitler.
Against the Nazis.
That's my point, is that you live in a messy world. It's like sometimes we have to make choices about who we support and who we work with, and at the end of the day, and also on 68, it's not 100% confirmed that they blew up those peace talks. Although it is controversial, I actually would still love, if anybody who's alive who was president at that time, we're still looking for total confirmation. I think détente was a great policy. I think SALT I was what this country needed at the time. He bought us a long time before Afghanistan, the eventual rollback people who came under Reagan. I mean, he, within the political confines at the time, pursued Vietnamization, signed the Treaty of Paris. He got our POWs out with I think it was part of the negotiation with the eventual Viet Cong. Under him and Ford, they did not, strike back against the fall of Saigon, which was the correct and unpopular policy at the time. So there were a lot of things that they did, which I support, and I think were, on balance, really good for America. Now, did he have a lot of mistakes, and did he make a lot of dumb calls like supporting the war in Iraq? Yes. He also opposed NATO expansion, spoke out for not interfering in Ukraine. He believed very strongly, as I do, in the spheres of influence ideology. So I don't think he is nearly as bad as many of the people who were dominant foreign policy figures at the time. And I think most of the reason people hate him is because of the resurgence. He became the icon of the devil during the new left, which is what most of the modern left is like a descendant of.
Well,
because of the expansion of the bombing
It's that,
of
but
Cambodia.
then it's also the long-standing influence. I mean, slaughter in Laos, slaughter in Cambodia, slaughter in Vietnam, slaughter in East Timor, backing Suharto. That caused the death, 200,000 deaths just right there. We were their #1 supplier of weapons. Backing the coup of Allende and, putting in place Pinochet and the, brutal deaths that resulted in. So I can't just look at that and be like, yeah, but, China, like, oopsie, genocide, what can you do? So,
but that's
anyway,
my only point is, how many civilians did LBJ, McNamara, and McGeorge Bundy kill in Vietnam?
Like I said, I'm trying to say there was lots of other evil done by other presidents and other national security advisors, but in any case, Not going to mourn this man's death after 100 long years of causing death and destruction.
I will give a book recommendation. People should read it. We'll put the book jacket up there on the screen. It's his early years, which is very instructive, not about Kissinger. Great biographies are about the people, their times, and what the foreign policy conversation looked like. It's by Niall Ferguson, or maybe it's Neil. I never know how to say his name. I recommend that people read it. Do not read the Walter Isaacson biography because it's a joke. I believe the only other credible one, if you want from a lefty perspective, is the one that you mentioned there.
The Trial of Henry Kissinger.
Well, that's the Hitchens
Hitchens.
book. But there's the one that the Yale historian wrote that you quoted him. I forget what it's called. That you just read in the Intercept biography. That one also, if you want to hear more of a critical perspective, you should also.
You could also hear from Anthony Bourdain in his book, who said, and I quote, "You'll never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands after visiting Cambodia." So there you go.
Bourdain, as usual, had some good takes. He also was a cringe boomer leftist at his worst. So I'll leave it at that too. How about that?
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.